In life, we all step up to the plate, hoping to hit a home run in our marriage, business, our family. What if the key was following a simple pattern? 4 words, 4 life-changing principles. There's only one way to get power at the plate. Connect with God. Once you trust God, you're able to win battles within yourself. Secure in your identity, winning relationships with others is next. Rounding third means winning results in whatever you do. Excellence matters. God created this game plan, a pattern different from the world's, so that we can have the full life He intended.
I don't think I mentioned this last week, but each week of this series, it's been inspired by a book that I read called Home Run by Pastor Kevin Myers. Now, if you were to pick up that book and read it, last week some of the stuff was pretty close to the book, but really these messages have been not different, but thematically the same, but in many ways they are very different. So if this message series has been encouraging to you and you want to get some more out of it, I'd encourage you to pick up that book, and I think that you'll find a lot of helpful things that we didn't even come close to covering here in our message series over the last 4 weeks. So we've been in this series, Home Run Life, and we've been talking about how, nobody gets up to the plate and wants to strike out. Right? We all want to score. We all want to win at life. We want to have success. And what we've found is, in the Bible, we found a pattern where God shows us how we can have a home run life. And what we've been doing over the last 4 weeks is we've been moving around the baseball diamond. Each week of this series is kind of built off of the last. So if you've missed any of these messages, I'd encourage you to get online and download those. You can watch them on video or audio, or talk to one of us. I know some of you don't have the internet. We can get CDs for you as well. But I want to remind us of where we've come from. Week 1, we started at home plate. And at home plate is where we talked about winning dependence. We talked about how spiritual maturity is becoming more dependent on God, not independent from Him. So for us to connect with God, we need to do so on His terms. We depend on Him. Then in the second week, we moved to first base. And at first base is where we win within. We talked about temptation, about how we need to develop character in our life. Last week, we talked about relationships, winning with others and community. We talked about how we need to forgive others. We need to value others more than ourselves. And that can be very, very difficult for us because we don't like to deal with the elephant in the room, which is so often relationships and family. But this week, we move to third base. And third base is where we talk about winning results. We talk about competency. Now, I want you to just look at this illustration that's on the screen here today, and I want you to think about how the world approaches life. Because for so many people in the world, they run the bases backwards, don't they? Or even maybe us. We're tempted to run the bases backwards because we want to start life by going and getting success and results first, right? We aim for a successful career. And in doing so, we miss out on God's design of starting by depending on Him and then developing character in our relationships and then finally moving on to winning with others. Look, I realize that this message series over the last few weeks may have been difficult for you. And I think it's because this pattern, going around the bases in this way, it's very counterintuitive to our society and to our culture. Our culture wants to run the bases the other way around. For many of us, or for some of us, it could be very difficult for us to depend on God. Maybe you've got a hurt. Maybe there's some pain or a trial you've gone through, and you're blaming God. It's hard for you to depend on Him. Or maybe you are experiencing a great deal of temptation in your life, and winning within has been a struggle for you. Or maybe, as we talked about last week, there are just hurts and pains, elephant in the room at your family gatherings, right, that are just very difficult for you. But I believe that when we run the bases in this order, that it sets us up not only just for success, but in particular to have winning results in our life. When we're competent and we can acknowledge God and we can serve Him with our whole heart. So what does it mean for us to win results? What does that look like for us? You heard it read in our text a little bit ago, but we find the answer to that question in Genesis chapter 50. throughout this series, we've been looking at the life of a man named Joseph. And you can actually find this pattern of these bases in other people in Scripture. But we've been focusing in on Joseph. And when Joseph was 17, we saw that Joseph had a dream. And I think Joseph thought that that dream was going to happen instantly, because he goes out and he tells his brothers and he tells his parents, but God has different plans. Instead of that dream coming true that he would be a great ruler and rule over even his family, instead of that happening instantly, what happens is at least 13 years pass, and Joseph finds himself being thrown into a pit. He serves as a slave in Potiphar's house, and he even is in prison during those years. 13 years go by before he becomes appointed to be Pharaoh's overseer, the second in command over Egypt, before he begins to see that dream, that home run life come true. Now, the pit, Potiphar's house as a slave, and the prison, these were not setbacks for Joseph. These were training grounds for Joseph. Joseph needed to endure all of these things so he could learn the skills necessary to accomplish the work that God had called him to do. And Joseph was faithful in that process. You know, I think sometimes we think that God is concerned with our success or our notoriety or our accomplishments, but God is not so much concerned with our success as much as he is our obedience. Now, when we're obedient to him, we will experience success, but we want to get it in the right order. It's success on God's terms and through his pattern. So at the end of Joseph's life, here at the last chapter of Genesis 50, we see Joseph speaking to his brothers. He's trying to calm their nerves. His father has just died, and he shows us what winning results look like. And the first thing that we see here in this passage is that winning results means that we complement God with our competence. We complement God with our competence. As you saw in that previous screen, there are 4 different C words that we've been using in this series. Connecting with God, we talked about character, talked about community, and today we're talking about competency. Competency has to do with how we apply ourselves to the task that is before us. And all throughout his life, Joseph showed competency, except for maybe at the beginning when he had the dream at the beginning. Joseph was a little arrogant there, and he was a little brash with his brothers. But outside of that, Joseph shows great competency. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. He serves in Potiphar's house, and he serves with such competency and with such a great work ethic that he is placed in charge over the rest of Potiphar's household as a slave. There are some false accusations that are made against him, and he's thrown into prison. And even in prison, Joseph proves his competency and his worth, and he is placed in charge over a portion of the prison. Later on, he's called before Pharaoh, and he shows his competency again by interpreting a dream that Pharaoh had. And he goes beyond that, just interpreting the dream. He actually tells Pharaoh what he thinks he should do because of the interpretation of that dream. Then Pharaoh appoints him to be second command over all of Egypt, and he again shows his work ethic and his competency by helping Egypt navigate a difficult season of famine. So time and time again, Joseph proves his competency through his hard, diligent work. And church, that should be the mark of every Christian. In the workplace, wherever you work, Christians should be the best and the hardest workers in the workforce, in the workplace. You know, we all know those people who phone it in. I know people in ministry who phone it in. I've had a variety of secular jobs throughout my life, and I know those people, they show up and they don't hardly work. They don't give it their all. That should never be the case for a believer. We should work hard. We should never, because nothing will hinder your testimony more than being lazy and in taking advantage of your boss and the business you work for. So to win results, it means that we need to put in tremendous effort and work, and we need to complement God with our competence. Think about David in the Old Testament. Many of us are aware of who David is. David was the shepherd boy who killed the great warrior Goliath in battle. And then he went on to be a great warrior on behalf of his people. He eventually became king, and we also know of some of David's discrepancies in his life. But think about what David did when he killed Goliath. What did he use to kill Goliath? Do you remember? It was a sling. He used his sling to kill Goliath. That was the perfect weapon that was needed on that day. But when you read through the pages of Scripture, you see that David didn't stay with the sling. He advanced in his military prowess. He moved from a sling to a sword. He had to apply himself to learn to use the sword because that sling was appropriate and effective for that battle, but it wasn't going to be effective or necessary for the future battles that he needed to fight in order to keep his people safe. David had to apply himself and work and be competent and grow, and that's what we're called to do as well. Here's my point. If you want to win results, it's going to take determination and effort, but the true test of winning results is determined by what we do with those results. And Joseph's response here in verses 20 and 21, they show us the proper perspective that we should have. It says this: "You intended to harm me." Remember, he's talking to his brothers here. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. You see, Joseph could have taken all the credit here. I did this myself. I got here on my own power. I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. I got here because of my own talents and my own abilities. But that's not what he does here. Instead of doing that, Joseph acknowledges God's sovereignty. He says, God's the one that gave me these abilities and these talents. God's the one that brought me here. You didn't throw me in the pit. You did, but God did it. God knew what he was doing. He brought me here to this place. And see, the problem is, some of us here, we want our competence to complement us, right? We want the credit for what we've done. We want other people to marvel at how strong we are, or how talented we are, or all the good things that we've done. Hey, you did such a great job. Oh man, you are so great. But do you know who really needs that? Children. Children need that. And it's a sign of maturity to move beyond that, right? We need to be the kind of people that don't allow our competencies to complement us, but instead what we do is we turn and direct that compliment to God, and we glorify him. And we say, it's not about what I've accomplished. It's about what God has accomplished through me. Our world wants to run the bases backwards and go to third base first and be able to get the accomplishments and beat their chest and say, look at what I've accomplished. But for us today, if we're going to win results, it starts when we go around the bases in the proper order and we allow our competencies to complement God and not us. You want to win results? Be competent, work hard, and give glory to God. Don't take credit from him, but give praise to God who gave you the ability. So first, winning results means complementing God with our competence. But then second, it means that we are a conduit of God's blessings, not a container for it. Joseph continues. It says this: Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. So these verses tell us just how blessed Joseph was. Now, if I live to 110, I'll be really blessed, right? I think I would love to live beyond that even, right? Joseph lived to 110 years, but that's not just some random number that's given there. In Egypt, in those days, we've got some ancient writings that have shown us that for the ancient Egyptians, 110 years, that lifespan was considered to be the ideal lifespan in those days. And so the Bible is telling us very clearly that Joseph lived a full and a blessed life. But it's not just his longevity that is being mentioned here. In addition to that, Joseph's blessings here are the fact that he is blessed with his children. He's able to see not only his children, his great-grandchildren, but also his great-great-grandchildren as well. Now, I would consider this to be a blessing, but it's absolutely a blessing in those days as well. These verses leave out some blessings. Let's not forget that Joseph here is second in command in all of Egypt. So he is in the palace. He has wealth and power and prestige and honor. So Joseph is blessed in a variety of different ways. And the point here is that Joseph had made it after experiencing a very difficult and a very painful life. You know, Joseph could have been self-centered at this point. He could have been self-centered. He probably could have justified looking out for his own self-interest after all the other hard knocks in life that he had experienced. But he doesn't do this. Notice that last sentence. It says, also, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Now, these are Joseph's great-grandchildren, okay, that are placed on his knees. This is not just simply saying that he got to hold his great-grandchildren. There's something else going on here. This is an expression. This is a Hebrew phrase that means that he adopted these kids. Now, it's kind of odd that even in our day where maybe a grandparent would adopt kids in this way. But in these days, it was done for a very particular, specific reason. And Joseph here is, again, a man of wealth, a man of honor and prestige. And when Joseph died, and he knows he's going to die, he's on his deathbed here. When Joseph died, his wealth would have been distributed to his kids and then on down through the generations. So by taking these great-grandchildren and adopting them and making them his own kids, what happens to these kids is their status and their inheritance from Joseph is instantly lifted, it's instantly elevated. So what Joseph is doing here is he's using his blessings to be a blessing to his great-grandchildren. He's elevating their status, he's elevating their inheritance. Joseph is using his blessing to be a blessing to others. He could have wasted his wealth and power on himself, he could have limited it, but he chose to welcome these children into it as well. So for us today, when it comes to God's blessing in your life, are you more like a conduit or are you more like a container? When God blesses you, do you just hold on to it, or do you extend that out to others as well? Pastor and author Mark Batterson puts it this way. He says, when God blesses us more, it is so that we can be more of a blessing to others. Now, this is why we give in our offerings. It's not just a thing that we do to try to make you feel guilty, right? It's not just something that, we got to have an offering time. No, we have a time of offering because we understand that as believers, if we are going to be winning results, that we are conduits, not containers. And yes, in a practical sense, that also has to do with our finances. We believe that God has given us resources so that we can be a resource to others. Look, I don't believe that God has given me what he's given me just so that I can waste it on myself. This is why we give here at Cornerstone. This is why we emphasize missions on a monthly basis. I've told you this before, but years ago when my wife and I first got married, we made a decision that we weren't going to have cable. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to have cable. You can have cable all you want. But for us and our family, we wanted to go without so we could have margin so that we could then give and be a conduit of God's blessings to be able to give to missions. So that's one of the reasons why we don't have cable today. It's not for a moral reason or one of those things. You may have those reasons. That's fine. For us, we just said, we're going to go out with that luxury so we can have margin in our life to be able to give. God's blessed us, and so we want to bless others. So are you more like a conduit or more like a container? Winning results means that we use our resources to resource others. We give more than we get. We serve rather than being served. Again, we have our fireworks event that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. This is our opportunity to be a blessing to our community. And it's a complex event, but it's just a simple act of love that we do for our community, loving our community, serving our community. And so for us, our job as Cornerstone Church is not to go out and enjoy, but our job is to go out and serve because we want to be a conduit of God's blessing in us, not a container. So winning results means complementing God with our competence. It means that we're a conduit of God's blessing, not a container. And then third, it means that we give hope for the future in light of the past. Genesis 50, verses 24 through 25. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. But God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. When you look at Joseph's story in the greater context of what's happening in the book of Genesis, we are left with some serious questions here near the end of this book. Because earlier in chapter 12 of Genesis, one of Joseph's forefathers, his ancestors, has been given a promise by God. God appears to Joseph's ancestor Abraham and says, I'm going to give the land of Canaan to your descendants. And so this promise kind of looms throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. 38 chapters go by and this promise is looming. Where are the Israelites? Are they going to receive the land of promise? And right here at the end, there's some confusion, there's some questions, because the people of promise are nowhere near the land of promise. Joseph is in Egypt. His people have just moved to Egypt. Joseph has a position of power. He is blessed there. So what gives? Did God make a mistake? Is the promise going to come true? What's going to happen? Are the Israelites going to enter the land? And then in the final words of Joseph, in the second to last verses of the book here, Joseph says two statements that have become ingrained in the language of his people. These two phrases are these. First, God will take you up. Now, oftentimes in the scriptures after this, it's in the past tense. So God will say, I am the God who brought you up, or I am the God who will bring you up. And so this phrase, taking you up out of Egypt, becomes on repeat throughout the scriptures. And then the phrase, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph is hearkening to the past. God has been faithful to our ancestors, and God will do something for you in the future. This is the first time we see these phrases. He calls on them to hope in the future in light of the past. These are Joseph's dying words. God will surely come to your aid. He says it twice. God will surely come to your aid. Or some translations say, God will visit you. So just like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when they were on their deathbeds, their main concern was the fulfillment of the promise. Joseph here on his deathbed, his concern is the same thing, the fulfillment of the promise. And Joseph is concerned about that, so he reminds his family of God's faithfulness. And he provides them with hope for God's future provision. Joseph's words here, that God will surely come to your aid, these epitomize the words of hope that the rest of the scripture have, and that we have today. So this verse here is the second to last verse in the first book of the Bible, last chapter. The last book of the Bible is Revelation. The last chapter, the second to last verse, is the same theme. It's Jesus in Revelation 22:20, and he says, yes, I am coming soon. The end of the first book of the Bible and the end of the last book of the Bible, the theme is the same. Joseph says, God will surely come to your aid, and in Revelation, Jesus says, I am coming soon. That's our hope, church, that there is a future hope for us. Joseph challenged the next generation with God's previous provision. He gave hope to the future in light of the past. And church, I have to ask us today, what message are you individually communicating with your life? Are you encouraging and communicating hope for the future or despair? Because I got to be honest with us today. Often I hear a lot of negative comments, right? Oh, our culture this. The degradation of our society of that. Kids these days, I'm saying that more and more, right? Kids these days, fidget spinners, what are those all about, right? Crazy. Culture this, culture that, this political party, that political party, this piece of legislation, that war, this group of people, that group. And we have to be careful, church, that we aren't communicating despair, but instead that we communicate hope. Why? I mean, is Jesus still on the throne of heaven? Is he still on the throne of your heart? Is he still alive today? Do we believe his words in Revelation that I am coming soon? Then our words and our lives should be filled with that hope. It should be directed in that, and it should be communicated to the generations that follow us. Who are you telling that to? Who are you telling that to? I mean, think about this. What gave Joseph the right to say these words? Yeah, I'm going to die. I want you to take my bones, and I want you to bring them into the promised land when God does that. What gives Joseph, what makes him so audacious that he would expect them to do this or even expect God to do this as well? The answer is twofold. First, because of what God did for Joseph throughout his life. And second, because of what God did, or what Joseph did for others throughout his life. If we're going to challenge the next generation to trust in God's future faithfulness and provision, then the next generation is going to need to see God's faithfulness in us and God's faithfulness through us. If we want to live this out, church, and I'm talking to the youngest in here, even though you're like, next generation, yeah, you are, but there are people following you as well, to the oldest in the room as well. If we're going to challenge the next generation by showing that we need to give hope for the future in light of the past. If we're going to do that, then people are going to need to see. They are going to need to see God's faithfulness to us and God's faithfulness through us. So how has God been faithful to you? I know he has. I know God's been faithful to you. So who are you telling? See, Joseph's story here ends with a cliffhanger. At the end of Genesis, the people are still in Egypt. And the question looms over us as we finish this book here. What will happen to the people of God? What will happen to the promise? What will happen to Joseph's bones? What will happen to the next generation? And I would submit to us today that our lives hang on a similar cliffhanger. What will happen to your kids and your grandkids? Will they accept Christ? What will happen to the next generation? You see, the world's view of success is pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It's by accomplishing it on our own. It's about giving ourselves the praise and the honor and the accolades for all that we've accomplished. It's about storing up treasures here. Look at my house. Look at the things I've collected. Look at the great car that I have. Look at the fancy clothes that I wear. This is the world's view of success. But Joseph, on the other hand, had a totally different perspective. He understood that his role, winning results, were so that he would complement God with his competence, that he would be a conduit for God's blessing and not a container. He knew that it was to give hope to the future and past of God's past faithfulness. Now, this is hard, but this is what we're called to do. This is hard, but this is what we're called to do. And we're going to make mistakes, and we'll fall short at times, but there's good news too, because there's one who came and who did this perfectly. Joseph is a great example for us, but Joseph is a mere shadow of Christ and what he accomplished on our behalf. You see, Joseph really just points us to Jesus. Jesus is the true and the better Joseph. Joseph went to the pit and to the prison, and he served as a slave. Jesus came to earth to serve people enslaved by sin. Joseph saved the nations by providing food during a devastating famine, but Jesus provides salvation and life by coming as the bread of heaven and offering himself on our behalf. Jesus is the true and better Joseph, who at the right hand of the King forgives those who betrayed him and uses his new power to save them. Those are the winning results that benefit us, and those are the winning results that we need to reflect in our lives as well. I've got two ways that we can respond today. I like to do two, because I like to keep it simple. You can apply this message in a variety of different ways, but I want to give our attention to two different ways to respond. The first is this: become a follower of Jesus. Joseph did a great thing at the end of his life by being giving and generous and providing blessing to those kids and passing on what God had given to him. But that is a mere shadow of what Christ has done for you. Jesus came and he lived a life that you and I couldn't live. He died the death that we deserved so that you could experience the blessing that you didn't earn. You could be forgiven for the sins that you have committed. I know today there are people in the room here that you feel that you are far from God because you've sinned, you've made mistakes. I want you to know, because of the work of Jesus on the cross, what you can do today is you can believe and you can declare. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you can be saved. Romans 10:9 says that. That's our promise for us. So if you're not a believer today, I want to encourage you to respond in that way by saying, I want to become a follower of Jesus. Second, be a conduit for God's blessing, not a container. Be a conduit. There's a variety of things we talked about today, but this is the one that is strong on my heart today. Be a conduit for God's blessing, not a container. Don't just withhold and hold on to what God has done in you, but bless others and be a conduit to allow those to flow to others, to the next generation. Be generous in your giving. Be generous in your conversations. Be generous in your relationships. Allow God to use you and work through you. Would you